No.
Tanisha, I really wanted to come to you for this next part because when you're talking about presentation and historical moment, I had to pull on your expertise as fashion. So I know I got other fashionistas on the panel, but I know that your work is particularly interested in the connection between agency and fashion. She introduces a really interesting moment in hip hop fashion. You know what I'm saying? I mean, like, for the longest, I wanted like the Pocahontas braids. You know what I'm saying? I couldn't dye my hair. My mom wasn't about that life at the time. She was like, you can't. I'm like, let me be great. But I mean, she had like the leather hats, and she had this just the whole kind of like sexier hip hop vibe, if you will. Why don't you start this part of the conversation? What is the significance of fashion and how we remember Mary J. Blige during this my life moment? And then the rest of the panel, feel free to jump in.
Okay, yeah, so first, shout out to the fellow fashionistas on the panel. Everybody's beautiful. But there's a way in which, we talk about, like, hip-hop generation fashion aesthetics, and sometimes we tend to collapse the different strains of style that are taking place, even within this quote-unquote golden age of hip-hop moment. But I wanted then, for a second, like, tease out some of these things in order to talk about how we can situate Mary J. Blige within this larger sartorial moment. So you have this vibe that's coming out of the New Jack Swing moment of the late 1980s and the early 1990s is really in part about bringing back that jazzy swing sound and New Jack and blending it with R&B. So there's a way that the New Jack style is covering both R&B and hip hop, and so the fashion itself is expressed through very bright colors, baggy clothes that will allow you to do those very sophisticated movements that really harken back to the dance hall swing era, right? So you have people flipping over each other's backs, So vibrant clothing becomes a part of that, and then you also have this kind of back to Africa, if you will, sect that's really about reintroducing the red, the black, the green, the colors of the Pan-African liberation flag, so we see this kind of expressed through lines like cross colors and Carl Kanai that are really thinking about this kind of cultural roots project that black folks, like people who are part of native tongues, for example, their music is really expressing that. And then even if you think about Mary J. Blige and what's coming out of the neo soul moment, right? How she looks different than that. That's more of this earthy, natural hair, bamboo earring kind of aesthetic that we think about people like Erykah Badu and Jill Scott as representing. But Mary J. is doing something different. And I think that her look really signifies this hip-hop soul space that she is carving out. And I think that the cover of My Life really is a sartorial expression of that, right? So we see her with the braids that you mentioned. I think those braids look a lot like the Dookie rope chains, those big fat gold chains that were really popular in the earlier years of hip-hop. Her braids kind of look like those chains that become this emblematic like style of early hip-hop, blended with the black leather apple cap that was really popular in the 1970s. And people like a Donny Hathaway, for example, shout out to you, Emily, that Donny Hathaway, helped to popularize for soul singers of the 1970s. So here she is with these gold chain link braids and the apple hat, right? So it's literally the marriage of hip-hop and soul that we see expressed through her fashion. And so there's a way that Mary gives us this My Life moment where she's literally mapping that out on her body and through the clothing choices that she's making. But then with the next album, Share My World, we see her on the cover still with her blonde hair. That's been a signature for her since even that first Father MC video. But we see this hair long and flowing, kind of blowing in the wind a little bit, and she's wearing the Fendi glasses, right? So there's a way in which now Mary has made it, right? And so that she's wearing these very high-end Fendi glasses. The look on that album is decidedly more glamorous. So we see what happens when a Mary J. Blige kind of assumes less of the Round the Way Girl dancer vibe that we see on the first album, and not the kind of edgy, darker My Life vibe with the gold chain hair and the hat, but now this more, you know, sophisticated but yet still very urban look. And so when we partner somebody like Mary J. Blige on that Share My World album with Lil Kim, who really in many ways becomes the epitome of this type of glamorized urban hip-hop aesthetic, then we see what happens when these two women are coming together sartorially to kind of map out a space for the high end for Black women performers in the late 1990s. So, and I just have to say, I love Mary too, and Lil Kim on that song, because they're one of the few people who have mentioned Tanisha in a song. Lil Kim says,
what?
So that, for me, it was like, yes, it was an homage, and it was two women who were really at the top of their game at that time, who shouted me out in the song. Me personally, it was Tanisha Ford they were speaking about, right? So, that, you know, of course, right? So for me, there is a certain terrain that Mary J. Blige is mapping out for herself, and some of those same fashion aesthetics we see early on in her career are still things that are sustaining her. Even when we get to some of her later work. And so when she does, you know, that My Life Volume 2 or My Life Part 2, whatever it's called, a couple years ago, she returns to some of those earlier aesthetics that she played upon in her earlier music.
Yeah, I love your breakdown of this. And it's so funny because I always change the Tanisha to Tree Van Ronda, but that's okay. Because my name is never going to be in a song. Partner with a random rapper and get my name in a song somehow, because I don't need that in my life. But I think what I really enjoy that kind of sartorial read of it, because I think Andre Harrell and when you mention Uptown Records, as they're making their image, and even when Diddy leaves Uptown and goes and forms Bad Boy, they want to create the aesthetic of ghetto fabulous, right? And Mary is almost the precursor to that moment, because she can embody that. By the time you get to Share My World, I think you actually see that more fully actualized as a sartorial choice, right? Because it's the Fendi glasses, but we have to know they're Fendi. That's part of the conversation, right? That's part of what makes the kind of ghetto fabulosity aesthetic pop. Like, you gonna know this is a Coogi sweater, right? And this is the 90s, y'all, so that's why I'm citing Coogi. Right? It's the Versace frames because it has the big signs on it. It's very particular. It's the prints of certain designers, so Gucci, Chanel, whatever it is, things that have very distinct logos and markings that come onto that. And Mary enters in that conversation later. With My Life and What's the 411, I'm interested to hear, and I'd love to hear y'all weigh in on this, about kind of a genderqueer reading of this and a rereading of like hip hop and somewhat moving into androgyny. And often we read androgyny in ways that reifies the masculine as the predominant aesthetic that's coming through. But Mary is very much so like, and I'm going down, it's the pinstripe pantsuit coming down the stairs, right, with the multiple versions of her. It's sexy, don't get me wrong, right, because it'll be Real Love, you have like the tube top with the corseted kind of thing, but then you have the baseball referentials in terms of jerseys, you have shorter haircuts, you have a movement that also adds to how the clothes look, that is like, even if it is something fitted or something that is seen as femme performance, she's still moving in a way that defies the kind of femme regulatory practices that usually come with certain items. And so I just wonder if we can think about Mary as someone who was already playing with gender in certain kinds of ways that don't necessarily take her out of a femme performance, because I think it is, but it's certainly not high femme performance. It's not high femme artifice. It is something that is absolutely blurring certain kinds of aesthetics and something that's decidedly hip-hop as well in that.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just jump in, I think a perfect example of that, and I'm so glad that you mentioned the I'm Going Down video, is the way that she sort of presents herself in that video. Also vis-a-vis, as Tanisha saying, mapping out the terrain, you know, amidst sort of that contemporary R&B moment, but how she positions herself vis-a-vis En Vogue. And so I'm thinking of En Vogue, and they're giving him Something He Can Feel, which comes out in 1992. And if you remember, you know, the video for that, right, is this very sort of classic Hollywood set in a nightclub. They have these
sparkle
dresses and the gloves and everything. And I mean, it's essentially it's a performance of seduction, right? In which we see all the men. It looks like it's all men in the audience. I think mainly men of color, who are loosening their hot under the collar. Like they can't even deal with how hot these women are, right? And so I think about that performance because that is a moment, in the early 90s when this Black women's group is covering a song from 1976, that's composed by Curtis Mayfield, performed by Aretha Franklin on the Sparkle soundtrack. We get to Mary J. in 1994 performing her own cover version of a song also from 76, the Rolls Royce, I'm Going Down, right? And they're both, I mean, it's so interesting because in both of those moments we see these women singing these songs that are, associated with the soul era, but which sounded, I think, like kind of throwback swing era type of songs even in their moment. In other words, they sounded vintage and retro in that moment of the 1970s, right? And so Mary J does her kind of version of that, and I think in part she's tapping into that, the success that En Vogue have with giving him something he can feel, but her performance is totally different, right? In her own video, it's also set in a nightclub, but I don't think she shows any skin whatsoever. She has her big, like, lush fur coat on, she's got her shades on, and then in that other part of the song that Treva was referring to, she's got her, dark pantsuit on, and she's kind of like slinking down the stairs, and I mean, it's almost not even stages of performance in some ways. I mean, it's not even clear if there's anybody in the club listening to her. But the point is that it's a totally different kind of very self-possessed and autonomous kind of performance of Black female sensuality, that is partly expressed through those sartorial choices.
Mm-hmm. I think another important reference point to put kind of in a triad with the En Vogue, the Mary J. Blige, would be Escape when they sing Who Can I Run To, which again is also coming through this whole kind of 70s soul era, 1990s hip-hop R&B reimagining of that 70s era. And again, their performance, I would say, is more similar to that of En Vogue, even though Escape is another one of these groups that really traffics in that tomboy chic space that Mary J. Blige often did in her early career. I mean, it was literally an aesthetic of the moment. There's a way that, TLC was another group who was doing that. SWV, another group that played on the whole baseball look with the cleats. They had everybody in my school literally going out getting baseball cleats. We wanted to walk around school in baseball cleats because SWV was wearing them. So there's a way in which people are playing around with androgyny, and you're right, Treva, it is in many ways skewing towards an androgyny that's based on the masculine, especially when we think about this earlier moment of the late 1970s and early 80s when the men were completely going towards the feminine side of androgyny, with the long straight hair and, the glitter and the body spray. And, it was just... But I think there's a way, too, that Ghetto Fabulous moment opens up another type of queer reading of fashion as well, because it's out of that moment, again, led by a Diddy, that we get this whole idea of metrosexual. Right, that all that is part of that same trajectory, right, where people are thinking about what it means when you're wearing bright prints and vibrant colors, and and you care about how you look. There's a way in which hip hop doesn't really have a language to try to grapple with that. So we call that metrosexual, and to explain when men want to carry a man purse and get manicures and wear pink. All pink everything for dudes, once we get into the early 2000s. So
Cameron, all day, the pink chinchilla. The floor-length pink chinchilla.
And you're so right with the prints. I mean, two of the biggest designers in that mid to late 90s moment for hip-hop culture is kind of gays become Versace and Coogee. Those are some loud, colorful prints that come out of those houses of fashion. You know what I mean? And that's what you wear. That was something that was aesthetically seen as oh, you made it, right? We made it, kind of thing. So I think that's really interesting to think about in terms of the gender politics of ghetto fabulousness and what that means in terms of gender performance, because it is loud, it is bright, it is showy, it is a marker of success that we don't tend to really think about. I mean, you get later into like Shiny Suit Man and all that kind of good stuff, but Biggie, who's seen as one of the kind of most hardcore instrumental figures and a seminal figure in a particular kind of aesthetic in early 90s hip hop, moving into to the mid to late 90s, and it's all about Fuji sweaters, them bright,
Down to the side.
post Bill Cosby sweaters. You know, I just, it's so humorous to look back at that.
But the other thing that I was thinking about too when you were talking about androgyny was Debrat and Missy Elliott. Because Debrat comes out with Funkified, you know what I'm saying? Nobody can quite place her. And that suits her well because she's the first, female rapper to go platinum, you know what I'm saying? But Missy though, like, Missy had made a trash bag hot. I mean, like, when you look at the in the Rain video, I mean, you have like probably like wind machines everywhere, and then this big ass, was it a plastic bag? I don't know. I feel like, but I mean, like, you couldn't quite place her, but she wanted you to focus on performance in terms of what she was saying and also how she was performing and not necessarily fashion, which is kind of really interesting because it still makes a fashion statement anyway. I just think that's a really intriguing moment in terms of connecting literal performance with fashion as a form of self-definition and agency. I think that's really interesting. But I have to wrap up this conversation. I'm sorry. You know how we do. The last question. So it's not necessarily a yes or no answer, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts about for all the work that Mary J. Blige has done publicly in terms of her own self-definition, in terms of making the way for the other avenues of entrance that we have talked about in terms of black women and girls, can we consider Mary J. Blige to be, and Treva helped me out with this one, is she gender progressive? Is she feminist? How can we place her and think about, what her contribution is to a larger conversation about black womanhood in a contemporary moment?
Well, like, these debates about who's a feminist often lead to all kinds of dragging and wars and on the nets and stuff. So, I mean, I'm always cautious to label anybody anything that they wouldn't label themselves. So first, let me start there. But I will say, as someone who's written about Mary and writes about Mary using a hip-hop feminist lens, I absolutely think you can't really talk about hip-hop feminism. You really can't talk about contemporary black womanhood from a popular culture standpoint if you have any investment in popular culture or cultural studies without putting Mary in that conversation.
Okay.
And that's very significant in terms of how we can approach her. I think you absolutely can approach Mary with a gender progressive framework, with a feminist framework, with a womanist framework, and uncover so much of what she's done and what these narratives, both the sonic narrative, the lyrical narrative, the performative narrative, the visual narratives that are there, and do a considerable amount of work and think about that. I certainly believe that Mary would identify her body of work as storytelling, which is the part of a feminist, womanist project. I also think she would identify as someone who wants to empower women and girls, both in her work musically as well as her work outside of that. And I think that's enough for me to want to engage her as someone invested in a feminist politics and feminist scholarship, that it is useful to me and that I related to her and I consider her among the large number of women and large body of work that gave me the strength and the wherewithal to identify as a feminist and to find that I had text and I had narratives and I had stories and I had spaces that were very, very richly defined and articulated to think about my own experience, to think about my standpoint. And from the perspective of kind of black feminist standpoint theory, I absolutely believe my life in particular is a way to think about a populist understanding of what black feminist standpoint theory can sound like and can be performed like and to be used in that way. So I'd love to pitch it to Mary. So Mary, if you're watching, love to know what you think about feminism. Holler at your girls, or just holler at me for tickets. Still love you.
Yeah, I mean, she's definitely invested in a woman-centered storytelling, and there are other women of this generation who are as well. And I think a moment that this really comes together for me is something that we now often overlook, but it's that Waiting to Exhale soundtrack.
Yes, Lord.
That soundtrack was everything. I mean, it was a
perfect. It's perfect.
So many women of different music genres, of different generations, who were all invested in that woman-centered storytelling into the same space. You had Aretha on there, you had Patty, you had Mary J. Blige, you had what was her name, Shantae Moore. You had,
to this day, don't know what "way you" means, but hey, it's still sexy.
I mean, and all the Brandy, you know, all these people who are, and this is really when Mary produces one of her anthems, you know, when she's singing Not Gonna Cry, you know, that I was your lover and your secretary had people going, you know, like when she comes in with that second verse and sings that line. But there's a way in which the soundtrack was really indicative of the woman-centered politics of Terry McMillan and the characters that she created in that film, and the diverse experiences they were going through as Black women. And so I think that Mary's voice on that project, for me, definitely speaks to what this woman-centered storytelling was looking like in the mid-1990s, and what happens when you put a whole, you know, group of Black women from different eras and, you know, into conversation with one another on one album. So that's my response to it. Yes, I think that Mary is definitely invested in a women-centered project that is all about empowering and uplifting women, and part of that means bringing a certain type of vulnerability and honesty that allows us to get away from certain tropes that mandated that Black women not talk about the interiority of their life in public, right? So for me, Mary becomes a very important voice of our generation who does that, and I think that Waiting to Exhale soundtrack, we need to revisit that. We need to do some more work with that, and even doing some work where close readings where we look at where those songs are lining up in the film, and what type of work they're doing in the film, or where we would position the song if it were to be in the film, where we think it would go. So anyway, that's my nod to Waiting to Exhale, because in the same moment, this is when me and my girlfriends go to our junior prom dressed as the ladies from Waiting to Exhale. Like, we all had a character. I was a Lila Rashawn character. I ain't afraid to say it. That was me. I was Robin.
He's a good man, Savannah.
Yeah, I mean, finally, I think I don't have much to add to what has already been said, but, you know, I love thinking about her work in terms of an intergenerational type of work that we see done on the Waiting to Exhale sort of soundtrack, and thinking about her in terms of, yeah, Terry McMillan in that moment in cultural production, you know, I mean, that the inroads that she made as you know, the first woman of Uptown Records, you know, and being able to say, and really kind of innovating hip-hop too. I mean, I think we generally tend to think of hip-hop innovation as coming through rappers and therefore through men, right? But the way in which the marriage that she really innovates between hip-hop and R&B shows that she is performing this new woman-centered storytelling that does privilege vulnerability, that says you can be tough and vulnerable and have street cred all at the same time, you know, and be desirous and be sad and be all of these things, claiming that complexity that the Black feminist tradition teaches us is so crucial. And yeah, in innovating hip hop kind of in that process. That's one thing that I think is so important about her work and her legacy for me.
Awesome. As usual, dope conversation. Ladies, thank you so much for giving me a little bit of your time to take a trip down memory lane and all that good stuff. Dr. Emily Lordy, Dr. Treva Lindsay, Dr. Tanisha Ford, thank you so much. I'm Dr. Regina Bradley. This is the 4991 series, Mary J. Blige, My Life. Y'all be easy. Take care.